Okay, over the next few slides we're going to look at characterisation, which is creating a character to interest your readers. Readers are interested in characters more than the story. We identify with characters if the character is well described, and also obviously if it has some similarities to us, or we can recognise some traits that make it human. Perhaps there are flaws that we also share, or perhaps there are strengths that we wish we had. Okay, some more detail about characterisation. These are some things to consider when you're creating a character. Now this information is for planning, and it's really unlikely that you'll use every feature of these when you actually have your character in a story. But if you have a sense of what the character actually looks like, it'll make it a lot easier to actually have them engage in action, because you'll give them a personality. If they have a personality, they're really interesting to read about. Rather than people just having a description of what they look like, you actually know what they feel and how they're going to behave, then they make a really interesting part of the story. And yes, there are some visual features to consider in your planning, because you have to have an idea of what they look like. But these appearance factors will also dictate some features of the character. Sometimes it will lead a little bit to stereotyping, but when you're aware of it, then you can actually think about ways to change that. So for example, a lot of people, they do race for some reason, they do African Americans, and all of a sudden they're in a gang or a football team or a basketball team. Well, sure, African Americans or Black Americans do a lot of other things besides those three things. Okay, so when you start to notice that you're actually stereotyping, think of something you can change. And there's other things to consider as well, beyond their physical attributes, that'll give the character a personality. Think of all the characters you've read about when you've read a book, or even when you've watched a movie, although a book is a much better reference than a movie. How much information you've actually known about the character. And that's what's interested. So people who grew up, I know you're probably a little bit young now, but grew up reading Harry Potter, know quite a lot about Harry Potter, not just his actions and what he looks like, but also his attitudes to things, his behaviours, how he responds to certain people and certain crises. So we know quite a lot because we know a lot about his personality. We don't just know what he looks like and then he waves a magic wand around. Now the next thing you can do to flesh out a character is some of the things listed here. Okay. Now you would have already maybe covered some of those in the previous activity, but some things you can add from these features to make a character even more detailed. There's more on this slide as well. When you think about it, for example, a clothing style, what your character's wearing, it's going to tell us a fair bit about the character, depending on what you do in the story or what type of story it is. If they're wearing preppy clothes, what does that tell us about the character? Or if they're wearing, bedraggled clothes, that tells us something as well. Their demeanour, like I said with Harry from Harry Potter, we certainly know some things about his demeanour. We know that he always sticks up for others, but we also know that he's not intensely worried about his grades, but except for the dark arts. But we know he's sort of an everyday student. He's not super bright like Hermione, and he's certainly not super lazy like Ron, but he's somewhere in between, like many students. This is always an interesting one if you can add, because character with flaws or something that goes against the idea of a perfect person always makes the character more human. So between these last two slides and the first slide, you should be able to build up a quite detailed profile of your character. And it's worth taking time to actually think about the character and the setting, so that the reader is actually really interested in what happens to them. Remember what I said about originality in terms of the actual storyline. There's lots of stories out there that already exist, and you can just manipulate them and use them for effect rather than having to create from scratch. However, what that doesn't mean is just rewriting a movie plot. Movie plots generally are taken from books, for one thing, so they're not particularly original in themselves, but they're well known, and it makes your story fairly boring because all I'm doing is just reading the plot of a movie. And I actually want to read the adventure of the character. On this page is an example from a well-known author from the 1930s, John Steinbeck. He's written many books, and many books that are still studied in lots of high schools today. And this is a small description of a character from one of his books. And if you read this, you notice a number of things. One is the vocabulary. He didn't get up, he emerged, and we have a definite place where everything's occurred. And we know pretty much already that he's out in the countryside in that first sentence. And then we get a little bit of visual description, an unusual feature, another unusual feature, certainly puffed and muscled hands, a description of an unusual part of the body rather than his face, his hands. And we get a little bit about his eyes. Notice we don't really get the colour of his hair, but we do get what it looks like. And then we get some action. He's stuffing his shirt, okay, unbuckling his belt, okay, and then he tightens it, okay, and then we get even though this isn't actually a action, this is a verb though, it's a description of how Billy's become a little bit better each year. And then we get more description of action, of him walking, and from this section here we get to know a bit about his personality, how he acts with the horses. And then we also find out his demeanour, that he waits, or that he is quite deliberate in his movement, but also that he's deferential, that he waits his turn, that he feels it's above his place to go in before the before the owner. There's a lot more detail in this than I've expressed, but you certainly can look at that as an example of how you describe a character in a story. Look at that, 3 paragraphs, one very short paragraph, and we certainly know quite a lot about this character from very good description. It's really important to have your characters do something. In English, we often talk about showing and not telling. Some of the ways to do this is to avoid using these types of verbs, okay, and sentences that are overly long and don't need to be, particularly when you're describing a character's action or behaviour, where they can be much shorter and still have a very descriptive effect. And then the use of verbs instead of adjectives is also a highly effective strategy. So instead of having the loud man, you have the man roaring. Instead of having old paint, you have the paint peeling. Instead of having a sad woman, you have a woman weeping. Okay, much more interesting to listen, and much more accurate in their description as well. The other point to remember is adverbs. We often use adverbs, but many times it would be better to choose a verb that is strong and conveys a much more accurate image or sound, whatever it is you're trying to convey, than what an adverb allows you to do. And the other thing to avoid is the word very. Okay, you can see use of very here. Okay, it describes it's a very hot day, but look how much more interesting these two are, and I still know it's a hot day, but I don't see the word very in them. This is a nice use of, a metaphor, okay, and this is a very descriptive sentence. The other thing you need to consider when you're creating characters is avoiding stereotypes, what we call cliched characters, which means avoiding just writing about characters that look like they've come out of a movie. Okay, so sometimes it might be adding a feature or something like they're eating something or they're wearing something unique. So perhaps it's a hat that was found in a bin or found on the side of the road and looks like an old hunted deerstalker's cap. Or perhaps they're eating a unusual item of food like a dragon fruit. All of a sudden that character is different, quite interesting or unique to what we're normally used to. As I said before about stereotyping, so the example when people write about African Americans, they always have them in gangs, or they have them playing basketball, or they have them playing football. Well, they can do anything. You know, just because they're African American, that doesn't have to mean they have to do those things. They could be an astronaut. They could be a professor. They could be a nurse. They could be an au pair. Avoiding the stereotype that you're building makes for a very interesting story, and it throws the reader off balance, which always makes the story interesting to read because it's unpredictable. And sometimes you can just use random features around you from people you know, or combine characters that you've read about or you've seen, so that they're not a standard stereotype character or a repetition of something you've seen on television. Definitely use sensory description. It's just as useful for characters as it is for landscape, and definitely use figurative language. As I said before, make use of people around you, your friends, your neighbours, your parents, your grandparents, your siblings. Because a lot of stories, the characters are based on people that the writer knows. Even though it might be entirely fictional, they'll take features of everyday people and incorporate those into those characters.